Some big performances on the Derby Trail. Locked makes a statement out west. Notable suspensions in the sport and more on this episode of the Win Play Show. Salutations, everyone. My name is Matthew DeSantis, and welcome to another episode of the Win Play Show here on NYRA Bet's YouTube. This is a program devoted to everything horse racing and handicapping, recapping some of the biggest stories from last week, previewing some of the big stories coming up, and keeping you up to date with everything going on in our sport. Now, before we get into that, I want to remind you to press that like button and subscribe to NYRA Bet's YouTube today. Subscribing is entirely free of cost, just notifies you when new videos are dropping on the channel. And listen, we got race previews, we have full card analyses, handicapping and betting tutorials, loads of specialty content like this one, as well as Snowbirds with Acacia Clement that'll be on later this week on the channel for the Tampa Bay Derby. And we got a lot of stuff for the Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks. So make sure to press that like and subscribe button today. All right. Well, like I said, welcome to the Win Play Show, where we recap some big efforts from the last weekend, look ahead to next weekend, the whole 9 yards. So listen, obviously, if you listen to our recap on Monday afternoon from the Kentucky Derby and Kentucky Oaks with myself and Kaylee Shapiro, you know some of our thoughts on the big races at the Fountain of Youth, the San Felipe in particular, but also up here in the Gotham, on the Philly side as well, in the Busher, in the Devona Dale, in the Santa Isabel. But I think what's interesting is thinking about this more broadly. And I wanted to use this space to kind of talk about the Kentucky Derby picture maybe a little more broadly than we do on those shows where we're really recapping individual races. This felt like the first weekend where we saw big efforts. We saw a huge effort from Magnitude in the Risen Star, admittedly, and then 2 days later, that horse was taken off the Kentucky Derby Trail. So in some ways, that effort just felt like an asterisk the whole time. Also, that effort kind of came out of nowhere, and I was very skeptical whether it could ever be replicated again. Yet, that said, this week felt like, okay, the heavy hitters are coming out. And I think part of it was Citizen Bull's a horse that won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, went to the Bob Lewis, controlled everything up front. Kind of the last 2 wins have been merry-go-round wins out west. And I think there's a lot of skepticism by people on the East Coast. Like, well, how good is Citizen Bull? He just kind of gets things his own way, unpressured, on the lead. Obviously a very talented horse, one that I really like actually quite a bit. I actually think now this horse has become underrated in some ways. But, Citizen Bull's been doing that out west. You had a horse like East Avenue that people were excited about. That horse comes, off the bench and drops anchor at the quarter pole, basically, and is a non-factor. And Brendan Walsh is just as puzzled as everyone else. The horse scoped all right, came back okay. And is actually back training now. It's going to be pointing towards that Louisiana Derby, but it was a little bit of a letdown. And you had a horse like Ferocious that I know a lot of people were really dazzled by that debut up here in Saratoga. Never was really able to get back to that. Ran a couple of good seconds to Chancellor McPatrick, to East Avenue, and then came back and really disappointed in the Holy Bull. And so you've had some efforts where you're like, the big-time players didn't show up in big-time games. That's always the saying, right? Big-time players make big-time plays in big-time games. That didn't happen necessarily the first few Oaks preps. This weekend felt like that, where Sovereignty comes off the bench and runs a huge race at Gulfstream Park. Now, I know there are going to be people who put an asterisk next to that effort and go, listen, he beat a couple of 2-turn horses that might not have liked the distance the last 16th. And just benefited from that and benefited from horses tiring. I don't think River Thames was tiring as much as I think he's green. And Todd even alluded to this after the race in an interview with the Huntus 305, where Todd said, the horse starts looking at the screen on the infield, and you can see his ears flick over to the left, and he's looking over there and just lost his concentration. And that happens with Todd horses, by the way. That's not an unusual trait. Mo Donegal had that same issue. Mo Donegal would lose concentration halfway through a race, and you're like, what are you doing? Go. I mean, Tapit Trice would kind of be like that sometimes, where he just, it was like down the backside. You're like, Tapit Trice has to be ridden so hard sometimes when he was young and a little less mature, just because it was like you had to keep the horse engaged the whole time. It's like, no, pay attention. Like, we have to go. And so, that's not an uncommon trait sometimes to see with a Todd Pletcher horse, but something that he trains out of them often and gets them, going in the right direction. So interesting to see. And But I think Sovereignty, listen, coming from the back, and we'll talk about this a little bit more with Locked in the Santa Anita handicap. It's not even so much who you beat, it's how you do it. That also is equally as impressive. Sovereignty comes from off the pace on a speed favoring track with a very short home stretch, going a mile and a 16th, and still manages to track down the leader in River Thames. I thought it was a really impressive performance. Earns a 95 Beyer speed figure. Here's the thing. What have we seen the last few years out of the Kentucky Derby? Pace meltdowns, right? Whether it's Rich Strike, whether it's Mage. Last year, Mystic Dan saved every single inch of ground, but was also still sitting behind the pace. Now, it was a little bit closer than those other two I mentioned, but it was still behind the pace. And then, oh, by the way, Forever Young and Sierra Leone, who completed the trifecta by that much, they came from well off the pace. So, these are things I just think that Sovereignty's running style sets up really nicely for the Kentucky Derby. You always have to worry about getting the trip, right? When you're coming from off the pace, you got to make sure you don't have to deal with traffic and that sort of thing. It's easier to do in a shorter field in a prep race. But nevertheless, Sovereignty, for that first effort in 2025, for that debut to come through and really deliver the way he did after some other horses from his generation have not, I thought was impressive. As impressive as that was, you go out west. Sweet Jesus. Journalism's a monster. And that's a horse that, as it kept getting closer and closer to the race, I saw him paddock schooling on Friday, and I sent the video of it to my colleagues at NYRA Bets. I said, this horse is a problem. I said, this horse is a monster. He's built like a truck, and the pedigree is fantastic in terms of curling up top out of an Uncle Mo mare. And this is a horse that has legitimate expectations for trainer Michael McCarthy. We talk so much about these, Bob Baffert horses out in California, and rightfully so. But journalism was an $875,000 sale. He wasn't overlooked. He was a legitimate big-time purchase with a legitimate big-time classic pedigree and a horse that has really done a beautiful job filling out and getting bigger. And the thing that was so notable about that San Felipe was how easy journalism just went by Barnes. It was easy. First of all, those two were 8 lengths clear of everybody else. So maybe we can stop with Rodriguez talk. But that, although I will say, I think if you put Rodriguez on the lead, he's a different type of horse. And so I do think that, I still think he's distance limited, but nevertheless, I do think he put forth a better effort if he was on the lead. But the thing about what was so fascinating is a lot of times when a horse goes by another horse, you'll see something, especially against this caliber of horse. When a horse goes by another horse in the home stretch and a horse on the lead, a lot of times they won't go right by. And it's a combination of things. Horses are pack animals. So sometimes it's the horse going by, maybe slowing up a little bit. And not to say that horse is a hanger, because they eventually get by. Some horses are hangers and just refuse to go by. But even horses that go by will sometimes maybe slow up just a little bit as they go by another horse. And also the inside horse is a pack animal as well. And once they see somebody go by, they try to speed up in some instances. Now, sometimes when horses get headed in the stretch, they just back up and then forget about it. But a lot of times they'll try to fight back. So a lot of times what you'll see is a horse zooming up, zooming up, zooming up. They get to where their competitor is, and then it looks like they kind of share strides for a while. And then eventually, the horse on the outside, in this case, kind of goes on to win. What was notable about journalism is that horse just went right by. There was no hesitation. There was no, I'm slowing up. And Barnes didn't stop running. It wasn't that Barnes stopped running. Barnes kept running really well. Earned a 105 Beyer speed figure. You had a journalism earn a 108. Just massive numbers. And you can talk about Santa Anita is a speed favoring track, and the numbers out there are inflated, and so on and so forth. Maybe so. But remember, Stronghold wasn't running any of those numbers last year. And Bob's horses weren't running any of those numbers last year out at Santa Anita. So even if you just look at how Santa Anita preps have gone recently, that was a big time effort from journalism. He's a horse I absolutely love. Number one in my rankings right now with a bullet. And again, a horse that can come from off the pace, but it has a little bit better tactical speed. Honestly, reminds me a little bit more of how you could sit that Mystic Dan trip behind the speed, but not so far back that you're relying on a golden rail to open up the way it did for Rich Strike, or the way that Mage was able to kind of navigate through traffic. But it's one of those things where a super impressive effort out of those guys. And it's great to see big time horses show up and put on big time performances and big time races. And it sets up for some fantastic racing coming up. Now, one of the races that is coming up in a couple of weeks is the Virginia Derby and the Virginia Oaks. And I want to talk about this because these are brand new prep races. The Virginia Derby and Virginia Oaks at Colonial Downs, by the way, a track I love. I visited Colonial many, many times when I lived in Northern Virginia. Love the people there. Best turf course in the country, in my opinion, is Colonial Downs. And so they have great facilities there. And it's out in the middle of nowhere, but it's a really lovely track. But they're hosting this 3-day event, not this current weekend, but the following weekend, March 15th. And they are going to be having the Kentucky Derby, or I'm sorry, the Virginia Derby and Virginia Oaks there. They normally are a fall meet. They're doing it in the spring. Churchill Downs, now that they own Colonial Downs, has decided to create a new prep and put it here. And it's on the dirt. Traditionally, those two races have been on the turf. So it's interesting. Here's my theory. Bob Baffert has a lot of horses. Cipriani scratched out of the Santa Isabel. Curious. Horse had just given a big work, looked like she was fine. Tenma, not entered, probably is going to go to the fantasy. Well, Bob's not going to run Cipriani in the fantasy. He's probably not going to have her just on the bench until the Santa Anita Oaks. She's going to need all the points in order to get in the starting gate then. I wonder, this is my speculation. Obviously, there was a lot of bad blood between Baffert and Churchill Downs over the last 3 years, but they've kissed and they've made up. And I just wonder if part of that agreement, and not to speculate anything nefarious, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing by any stretch, just a theory I have. I wonder if Baffert sends a couple of horses to Virginia and Colonial Downs as kind of not a mea culpa, as kind of an olive branch, another olive branch maybe to go, hey, listen, here Churchill's running these brand new races out in Virginia, and I have a bunch of horses on the Derby Trail who need to get points. I have some fillies on the Oaks Trail that need to get points. They have this new prep race. It's going to be interesting to see like who's exactly entering horses in those races, because there's not a lot of mid-Atlantic trainers will enter their horses up in New York here. We've seen that. And, in the Wood or in the Gotham and the Jerome and the Withers, all of that. And so it's interesting to see. I wonder if Baffert sends a couple of horses. In particular, Cipriani. I wonder if Cipriani goes to the Virginia Oaks. I wonder maybe who he sends, whether it's gaming or, probably not Getaway Car, but maybe Getaway Car to the Virginia Derby. And I think that's just something interesting to keep an eye on, because Baffert has so many horses that he needs to split them up somehow. The challenge is if you split them up too much, now suddenly the field sizes in these races in California are too small and you're not getting the prerequisite number of points. I have a feeling that they are going to make sure that there are enough horses in the starting gate for the Santa Anita Oaks, or the Santa Anita Derby and the Santa Anita Oaks, so that those are not point deducted final preps. That would be a little bit of a black eye and a little bit embarrassing for California to have their final round of preps and it be worth 75 points, 50 points even potentially, as opposed to the 100. And those are new rules that Churchill just rolled out this year, that if you have really short fields, however many points that was allocated, if it's only a 5-horse field, it gets only 75% of the points. If it's a 4-horse field, it's only 50% of the points, and so on. So that's something to keep in mind. But I'm interested in that Virginia Derby and Virginia Oaks, and I have a feeling that we're going to see some Baffert horses entered in that race. Just a gut feeling. I could be entirely wrong about it, but just something curious to think about, keep in mind. Well, listen, like I said, big efforts all around, but the real big effort this weekend was also Locked. Put on a show in the Santa Anita Handicap. And I'll be honest, that's a horse I absolutely loved. I loved him in the Cigar Mile and ran second, obviously, to White Barrio in that Pegasus World Cup. But Locked, man, he went out there west. He shipped out west, which was, I thought, impressive to do on the first place. And Jose Ortiz took over the mount. Had ridden the horse previously. Johnny Velasquez was on the last few times. Johnny V was on River Thames down in Gulfstream Park. But nevertheless, you have Locked with Jose Ortiz aboard. And he's floating him out wide going into that first turn. And he's 4 wide. And I'm thinking, this is a 1.25 mile race. Like, what are we doing? Not only was he 4 wide the first turn, he was 4 wide on the second turn too. and still blew off the rest of the field and won by 8 lengths. I mean, just a dominant performance from Locked, and the sort of performance that gets you excited for this older handicap division. Now, I saw some people go, well, he didn't beat much. And I wouldn't disagree. Express Train finishing second, very hard running 8-year-old Hit Show, who's a nice graded stakes winning horse, finished third. And yeah, he might not have beaten much, but I would say 2 things. One is the way in which he did it. You float that far wide going around both turns, going 1.25 miles, and you just look that strong at the end of the race. That's impressive. I don't care if you're running against air. That still looks really impressive. The other thing to keep in mind is while the older handicap division is getting stronger this year, Sierra Leone, Fierceness, Mindframe, who runs in the Gulfstream Park Mile this past weekend, runs really well. Just a Touch is back for Brad Cox. You know, you have a couple of horses coming back, and now you have Locked. You have White Abario, who seems to refound his form. So there's a lot there. And that's the cream of the crop. But until they all face each other, yes, some of these races are going to feel a little lopsided, where it's like there's kind of this elite level of grade 1 horses, which quite frankly, we have not had the last couple of years. We have not had on the male side, elite grade 1 horses. We've had a lot of horses win grade 1s. Okay. They're winning them. But is Highland Falls an elite horse winning the Jockey Club Gold Cup? Right? Like, are these elite horses necessarily? They're good horses. They're very good horses in some cases. This feels like the first year where we're seeing, in a couple of years, where we're seeing elite horses at the top. Now, obviously, Locked is one of those. Like I said, you have Mindframe coming back, Just a Touch. Sierra Leone is in training. Fierceness. Sounds like Rapoli says we're going to the Met Mile. Going to go to the Whitney. So, you know, that's kind of the trajectory that you see with Rapoli's and with Fierceness. So that's going to be interesting. Obviously, going back to the Breeders' Cup Classic, going to be a lot of fun to see those horses up here this summer in Saratoga. And yeah, and then the key is then you got to fill in that depth, right? So if you have those elite horses at the top, you still need those depth horses. And I actually think the depth is starting to come. It's just a matter of it needs some time. And honestly, you need some horses to run at 5 and 6. You need some horses like Express Train who are still running at 8. But I think a horse like Hit Show is a really important horse to have. You know, I've talked about Skippy Longstocking. I think those 2 horses are cut from the same cloth. Grade 2, grade 3 winners who are a little short at a grade 1. But you need those grade 2, grade 3 winners to make those grade 2 and grade 3 fields look even better, right? And to get more interest around them. So again, and then when they step up to a grade 1, hey, they have a pretty good resume. You know, they're a multiple-time graded stakes winner. This is not just some horse that's being entered from an allowance race. This is a nice horse. So, again, I think it's good to see this older handicap division getting a little bit stronger, but Locked, he put everybody on notice with that effort on Saturday in the big cap out at Santa Anita. That was impressive. That was a fun race to watch. 109 buyer speed figure, big time effort. Can't wait to see Sierra and Fierceness coming back now. That's going to be so much fun. So going to be really great. Speaking of a return, the big return this coming week, of course, Thorpedo Anna. She's coming back in the Aziri, the reigning horse of the year for trainer Kenny McPeak, the dominant horse in the Distaff division, who came up just a little short against Fierceness in that Travers while beating Sierra Leone, who, of course, goes on to win the Breeders' Cup Classic. She's coming back, and she's running against the girls, which I'm glad Kenny is doing. And the intent appears to be the Aziri, the Apple Blossom, in terms of the first 2 races. I think at that point, you know, he'll probably run something on the undercard. You know, I think it's the La Troyenne. He'll probably run at Churchill on the Kentucky Derby undercard, maybe, or maybe not. Maybe he skips that one depending on how she comes out of it. We'll see. That would be a little bit of a tighter turnaround, especially just to start off the year like that. So it'll be interesting to see. But she's the dominant horse in the Distaff division. There's really not a lot there to make you think that anybody's going to challenge her, because remember, Idiomatic's retired, Adair Manor's retired. So some of the better older horses have already retired out of the Distaff division. You know, it's going to require some of these horses that were 3 years old last year really stepping up and continuing to improve. A horse like Candied, maybe. But, you know, we'll see. That Aziri field, I know Kaylee Shapiro is going to write about it for NYRA Bets YouTube and write about it for NYRA Bets. So you make sure to check all that out. But It's exciting that she'll be back. And I'm excited to see whether or not Kenny runs her against the boys again. You know, whether the Travers was a one-off. And if I had to guess, I don't think he runs her much against the boys. I have a feeling that it might come in the Whitney, that he might try to go back up to Saratoga. She took to that track so well. She ran such a big race in the Travers against the horses that she'd be facing again in all likelihood, Fierceness and Sierra Leone in particular, that it just feels like maybe that's where he would take a shot against the boys. If he's going to do it in her four-wheel campaign, it would feel like that's going to be a spot for him to do it. We'll see. But, man, it's going to be a lot of fun with her back on the track. And, again, is it a great betting product? In some ways, yes, because in some ways it's a fantastic betting product because you can single her and then you can find some prices and some big prices in the other races around that race that she's in. Also, as a fan of the sport, I like seeing greatness. I like seeing greatness in any sport. I like seeing great athletes be great. And when I see great horses be great, that gives me chills. That gives me goosebumps. That's what excites me, is seeing great horses do great things. And that's what Thorpedo Anna. She's a great horse. She's a reigning horse of the year. So can't wait to see her in the Aziri. We'll have a lot more coverage on that later this week. All right. Well, we also have some other news that I think is notable. 2 significant suspensions handed out by HISA over the last week to 2 very significant trainers. Todd Pletcher is suspended, accepts a suspension, a 7-day suspension for a positive test of betamethasone on his horse Vasimo. Now, if you remember, I've talked about this before with betamethasone. This is a regulated substance. This is not a prohibited substance. It is simply a substance that is regulated. So horses are allowed to have betamethasone, but it is regulated in terms of how much they may have in their system, when they may be administered it, etc. So Pletcher was facing a potential 15-day suspension because this was his second violation of this type, and instead just chose not to fight the positive test. As a result of not fighting the positive test, the suspension was reduced from 15 days down to 7 days, and so Pletcher will accept that suspension. Now, around the same time, Gustavo Delgado, who is, of course, the trainer of Kentucky Derby winner Mage, and has been training Ferocious, who was just taken off the Kentucky Derby trail just earlier the last week, he also was suspended for 7 days due to a positive test for another regulated substance. And this one was more of a topical analgesic that was administered to the horse. And so he is serving a 7-day suspension for that. I bring up these 2 suspensions for the following reason. How they are portrayed by the media covering horse racing. The headline on Blood Horse, which is a website I visit every single day and I love. But the headline on Blood Horse is Pletcher accepts fine days for betamethasone positive. Okay. The headline on Delgado is Haiwu suspends Delgado for controlled medication finding. 2 very different tones to those headlines. Pletcher accepts fine in days. It makes Pletcher seem magnanimous, okay? And it also lists the drug, betamethasone. And anybody knows anything about horsing knows betamethasone is an allowed substance and just a regulated substance. And so you go, okay, well, Todd's accepted some fines and some for something that's allowed, but just maybe not regular, an overage, basically. You read the other one about Delgado, Haiwu suspends Delgado. First of all, it's now Haiwu taking the action, right? Pletcher accepts a fine. Pletcher's taking the action. Now Haiwu's suspending Delgado for controlled medication finding. So again, not naming the substance, making it seem a little bit more ominous. And again, just the way headlines matter. And I bring it up because, listen, I taught media and politics for a long time in college. And, you talk about framing of a story, how a story is framed by the media, the headlines that are used, how that shades the way people think about it. Because here's another statistic that I know from studying political science. About 80% of people who claim to read articles read the headlines. They don't actually read the article, they read the headline. So when people just read the headline, if all you get is the headline, you read that headline, Pletcher accepts, Haiwu suspends. Those are two very different actions that are being taken when you just read the headlines there. And by the way, this is absolutely no shot at Todd Pletcher, who I think is a phenomenal trainer and by every account a good human being. And you also, and you look at some of the assistants who have come out from Todd. You look at the relationship somebody like Whit Beckman has with Todd Pletcher. You look at the relationship somebody like Amelia Green, a female trainer who just is breaking out on her own, the relationship she has with Todd after working for him for all those years. Todd Pletcher is a good man. I don't doubt that at all. And these sorts of overages happen. But it's interesting to see how the media portrays these overages depending on who is being suspended and who they are. And again, when we're talking about overages, that's what Bob Baffert was always pinged for. Bob was never caught with something that was a genuinely banned substance, right? It was an overage. That's what Medina Spirit was, 19 picograms. Remember, we all got familiar with picograms during that. It was always an allowed substance that there was too much of it in the system. Well, Todd's got those too. And he's got quite a few of those. And, nobody really says anything about it. And I'm not saying that they should because these overages happen. We've talked about this before. Overages happen, and they're a lot more common than people realize. And it doesn't mean that there's anything nefarious going on, but how it is portrayed by the media, by social media, by individual users who have big platforms, how it is portrayed is a whole other story, though. And that is worth something, that's worth investigating ourselves, than thinking about it ourselves. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that one of those headlines is written about a white trainer, and one of those headlines is written about a Latin American trainer. And whether that, I'm not accusing anybody that that's what it is, but this is the sort of thing that is just sometimes implicit bias that we see. And so it's something that's worth always being critical of when you read headlines. I mean, this is something I can't help. I do this because I read a lot of political headlines, left wing, right wing, middle of the road, doesn't matter. I read a lot of political headlines, and you're constantly dissecting them and deconstructing them. So I encourage you to do the same thing when you're reading these headlines for these different stories that are out there. So just something to think about as we continue to see HISA crack down on different things. We talked about that case last week in Pennsylvania about a long-ranging investigation cracking down on the intra-articular joint injections that were being done illegally by a veterinary person in Pennsylvania and some of the trainers associated with that. So, as these things continue to happen, it's important to see how they're being portrayed, how they're being framed, how they're being discussed by the media and the people consuming that. Well, let's finish the day on a high note, and that's the easy thing to do because let's talk about Kendrick Carmouche. And Kendrick is hard not to say that Kendrick's one of your favorite riders if you follow the New York circuit at all. Kendrick is affable, always quick with a smile, joking around with other jockeys. Just watching him interact with people in the paddock at Aqueduct is truly just something fun. And you don't see any other jockeys really having as much fun as Kendrick is having all of the time. And he's giving shout outs to the fans and pointing up to them when they're on the rail overlooking the paddock at Aqueduct, and they let him have it one way or the other. And when Kendrick wins any race, there's a huge celebration. Everybody's cheering. It is a lot of fun. He is a fan favorite up here at Aqueduct. He's a great rider as well. He knows how to get horses into good positions. I've always been a big fan of him. And I also love that Louisiana accent of his. He and I have a shared love of both Popeyes. I'm a bigger fan of Bojangles, but we'll I'll let that slide for now. But, Kendrick's just a character, and he's a really fun guy and a really nice person. And it was great to see that he was recognized by winning the George Woolf Memorial Jockey Award this past week. And I just want to say on behalf of myself and everybody here at NYRA Bets and NYRA, congratulations to Kendrick on receiving that award, which is awarded via a nationwide vote of his fellow riders. And it really speaks to not just the career, but the personal character that somebody like Kendrick has throughout the sport of thoroughbred racing. And for the fact that he is recognized by his peers, I know means so much to him, a second generation jockey and someone who, like I said, is so beloved up here in New York. Just congratulations to Kendrick on winning that George Woolf Memorial Jockey Award. It's very well deserved. And I look forward to many, many more raucous celebrations in the paddock with the people hanging over the balcony, yelling Kendrick's name, him giving them a shout out, and a lot more, Kendrick coming out of the jockey's room, joking around with his fellow jocks, having a great time, keeping things loose, keeping things fun, even in the middle of the winter at Aqueduct. So Kendrick, congratulations. All right. Well, that's going to do it for this week on the Win Play Show. But hope you guys enjoyed it. And make sure to tune back in for all of our other content that we have. Like I said, Acacia Clement's going to join me later this week to talk about on Snowbirds, to talk about the Tampa Bay Derby. Going to have some Oaklawn Pick 5 coverage. Going to have some more Road to the Kentucky Derby, Kentucky Oaks videos. So plenty more right here on NYRA Bets YouTube. My name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and profitable day at the races. And reminding you, friends, it's now post time.